Well, hello, everybody, and welcome once again to another episode of Under the Macroscope. My name is Matthew Pierce, and apologies in advance for the slight frog in the throat, but no need for dramatic concern. I have had a COVID test, and it came back negative. So hopefully the frog will be on his or her way quite soon. As usual, we're going to be taking a look at some of the factors affecting global economies on a macro level with Skybound Capital's chief strategist in the UK office, Jabir Sadawala. Coming up in this podcast, we've got quite a mixed bag. We're going to be talking about rising interest rates in certain emerging markets, and that's something to certainly keep an eye on to see who follows. We're going to be talking a bit about US stimulus and the effects thereof, an update on the vaccine program, which has a knock-on effect across the globe, regardless of where it's happening and how. But first of all, Jabir, I mentioned to you just ahead of recording the podcast that I woke up in South Africa this morning and was told by one of the people that I follow closely, brace yourself in the South African market. There was some big downward moves in US markets, certainly equity markets. What's going on? It looks as though equity and fixed income markets are searching for what is equilibrium at the moment.
Yeah, hi Matt. I mean that's absolutely right, and it actually stems from the US. Um, so we had the big Fed meeting, and Jerome Powell was put under the microscope, and the Fed has basically come out with a whole bunch of revisions, upward revisions in their forecasts. Um, and I'll give you a couple of examples of it. I mean, for instance, they are now expecting growth in the US this year to be around 6.5%. Now, prior to that, they had forecast 4.2. So that's a big shift. It's by
That's
any
50%.
standard. Yeah, correct. It's a huge shift. And if you look at what they call the dot plots, now, that's basically where they assess each voting member on the FOMC, the Fed Open Market Committee. There's a clear shift in expectations of an earlier rise in rates than had originally been forecast. They're now showing that more voting members expect a rate hike in 2022. Now, bear in mind that this originally was 2024. So all these figures are coming in. Now, they're still far out, but just much less so. Just other things that came out of it is, they expect the unemployment rate to be at 4.5% by year end. They think that inflation, this is an interesting one. They think that inflation is going to be at 2.4% by year end. In other words, above target being at around 2%. With the more important core rate at 2.2, so even that will exceed the target. Now, previously, both those measures, the headline and the core, were forecast to be at 1.8. So even the Fed itself is having to dramatically revise upwards its forecasts. Just as an FYI, I mean, housing in America, Americans use a lot of lumber in their buildings, and lumber prices have tripled since last year. It's added some $24,000 to the cost of an individual house price. $24,000. This is from the NAHB, the National Association of House Building. So what you've got now is an increase also in the 30-year mortgage rate, which is, it's risen again for the fifth straight week. It's well in excess of 3%, 3.09%. And all these basis points matter. So what it's doing, the end result has been a big surge yet again in the 10-year Treasury, which now I see stands at around 1.75%. It's come off a little bit, actually. It had hit 1.8. But 1.75, bearing in mind that at the start of the year-end forecasts at the upper end for the 10-year was around 2%. I hadn't seen anything in excess of 2. And here we are. We're not even at the end of Q1. And we're hitting, we've hit 1.75. So this causes a lot of frustration in markets. We've seen it in the US. It's down today already at the open. It was down yesterday. It's going to finish the week down if things carry on, unless there's some dramatic turnaround. Um, and that's having a knock-on effect. It just shows the importance of the US to the worldwide economies. Um, and then you've also got a mixed bag on the interest rate front, where people aren't quite sure what emerging markets are actually going to be doing. Which I'm happy to elaborate on. But we're
No, I think
seeing
you should. I mean,
signs. Yeah,
you mentioned Turkey
yeah,
as hiking rates, and possibly Brazil,
that's
and
right.
keeping your eye on other emerging markets where it, you got to find the balance between effective exporting and the value of your currency.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, by and large, if you divide the world between DM and EM, actually, there's a third category. You've got essentially DM, EM in commodities. Okay, now there is some overlap. It's a bit like good old-fashioned Venn diagrams in mathematics. There is some intersect there, but just keeping it simple. What you've got is a situation where EMs largely still rely on exports. Now, a weaker currency tends to favor exports because it makes your exports cheaper overseas. A rising currency curbs inflation. So I would have thought logically that if we're going to come out of this COVID mess, which we will, I mean, that's I don't think that's an issue. Look at those growth numbers I just read out, by the Fed itself, and I've seen numbers far in excess of that. Um, you have to wonder where EM world strikes a balance in all of this, because typically what we've had is competition for a weaker currency. That's what generally the world, countries around the world prefer. Um, but what we now seem to have is a very mixed picture. So we've had indeed a situation where Brazilian central banks, the Brazilian central bank could well hike rates. In fact, there was talk about that happening this week. Um, just to complicate the picture in Brazil, which is interesting, is that the former president, Lula, as he's known, was cleared by the commission of wrongdoings, which means that he can now stand for presidency again. And if that happens, you're going to have a very polarized society. It's already having an impact on markets because you've got the extreme right wing Jair Bolsonaro, the incumbent, and then potentially you've got Lula, who's really left wing and still quite popular with the masses. Um, so all that's going to do is really cause havoc in Brazil, which is where debt is growing at a ridiculous rate. One of the things they have to do is really undergo sort of extreme austerity in order to fix their economy. And if you end up in this situation where you've got left wing versus right wing, that's just going to compound the problem.
Mm.
But carrying on with the interest rate theme, now there's talk that rates could be going up in Nigeria and South Africa, which could be, no one really welcomes rate rises at a time when we're all trying to come out of a COVID-induced recession. Um, we had yesterday, we saw Turkey, its central bank raise rates 2%. Its repo rate is now 19%. So it obviously gave the Turkish lira a huge lift. But they've done this to tame inflation. So it's constantly the same old theme. You've got inflation, obviously growth, and rising yields. It all manifests itself in rising yields.
Can we just go
So
back?
yeah,
Can we go back to the US for a second?
yeah.
The timing and the content of those upwardly revised forecasts on growth. How much of that do you put down to last week's confirmation of the stimulus package? Well, we discussed it on last week's podcast, the fact that it was voted in. How much of a factor is that? Are we seeing now already the positive effects of that stimulus package?
I think we are, because or certainly that's one big part of it, because uh, stimulus checks have already started going out in the US. In fact, bear with me, I'm just trying to find in my notes. Yeah, here we go. So the US Treasury has already sent out 90 million direct payments worth some $242 billion to Americans via direct deposit transfer. So essentially, they are now ready to use that if they want to. Now, there's a different school of thought, and I've looked at a couple of interviews as to what the average Joe blogs, or John Doe, as they call them, is going to do with that stimulus checks, with those stimulus checks. But a further 150,000 paper checks went out in the post, and they're a smaller portion, but still, $442 million. So that's available to spend. And I think that's had a big impact on Fed thinking. They must be looking at this and thinking, well, Biden's done very well to get, such a huge figure through. The concessions he had to make were quite minimal. And now there's more in the pipeline in terms of infrastructure and the green energy bill.
Jabir, I have to say slightly flippantly, I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about that last statement is the existence of paper checks.
Yeah. Some old habits die hard, I think.
We're fast running out of time, unfortunately, but we can't have a podcast at the moment without talking about vaccine rollout programs. And it's all a bit messy. UK and Europe, AstraZeneca vaccine has been in the news. And a concept that you're describing quite aptly is vaccine nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is just that. Honestly, it's almost become another political tool, a political weapon. So how, what's the background to this? I mean, well, you've seen how Europe twice now has threatened I'm going to call it a blockade on the AstraZeneca side of life, because they're arguing that AstraZeneca hasn't fulfilled its obligations. And then on top of that, various other vaccines like Pfizer, Moderna, which get shipped under the agreements that were signed, get shipped across to Europe. Part of them are actually manufactured in Europe. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Moderna who has part of its vaccine manufactured in Spain. And then it gets shipped on to the UK and other destinations. So you've now got a situation where the EU, because of its really badly planned vaccination program and rollout, has threatened action on those further exports, or at least they've reserved the right to do so. So that has compounded the argument between the UK and the EU. And yeah, quite rightly, it's now being labeled vaccine nationalism. It's quite sad, but that's not helping markets either. It's compounding the impact.
It all sounds very messy to me, and how sad in a way that people's health and well-being is, as you describe it, being used as a political weapon.
Exactly. Yeah,
very
absolutely.
Jabir, as always, great to catch up with you and get your views. The Under the Macroscope podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, and the Google podcast platform for Android. And all past editions of Under the Macroscope are available at Skybound Capital's website on www.skyboundcapital.com. Thanks as always, Jabir, and thanks to Ross Muller in the Skybound Capital office. And until next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week.